We ask a question.
I don't know.
Guess you're not going to ask a question.
Ghosts, spirits, and the paranormal. These subjects continue to fascinate people from all walks of life. Today you can find ghosts the popular subjects of movies and literature. Spirit mediums and ghost hunters are the source of popular television programs. In almost every major city you can find a ghost tour to attend or a supposed haunted historical house to explore. The Ouija board game and tarot cards have been popular for their use at parties, and especially mine. American society has an interesting relationship with the spirit world. Whether you're a believer or not, we still seek out the paranormal.
So you ask a question.
Do you want Emily to ask a question?
But the hype surrounding spirits of the departed is not something new. In American history, the height of this interest can be found in the spiritualist movement of the late 1800s. Spiritualism is defined as a movement based on the belief that departed souls can interact with the living. In the United States, spiritualists really began to emerge shortly after the Civil War. The nation was in turmoil and chaos. Almost everyone across the country had lost a loved one in the bloodiest conflict on American soil. It was very confusing and a troubling time for society. I think this is why so many people became so interested in mediumship. It gave them hope. The story that I want to focus on is one about my great-great-grandmother, Mary Eddy, and her brothers William and Horatio Eddy. They were at one time one of the most well-known families of spirit mediums in the United States. Eventually their fame wore off and the community forgot about them. The only way the Eddy family legacy lived on was through the family. I first heard stories about my great-great-grandmother and how she was able to levitate pencils in class or talk to ghosts when I was a small child. These were frequent bedtime stories by the way of my father. Of course, it's hard to find truth in the legend today. But now the story is not just a family story. Within the past few years, the Eddy family stories have been circulating around New England once again. I recently got in contact with a man named Jason Smiley who gives lectures about once a month on the family and the legend and truth behind them. He is not a descendant of the Eddy family. After going to a few of his lectures in Vermont, I noticed large crowds. Groups of people that are in no relation to the family at all gather to hear about their story. It's like the Eddy family has been brought back to life. A popular New England author and folklorist, Joseph Citro, has also helped to revive the Eddy family legacy through his work in recent times. Whether you believe the Eddy family had otherworldly powers, or that they were con artists or just talented performers, there's no denying that their story is remarkable. I first traveled from my hometown of Granville, New York, to Burlington, Vermont to interview Jason Smiley about his presentations and his involvement with the Eddy family legacy.
My name is Jason Smiley. I live in Milton, Vermont, and I work full-time at dealer.com as a compliance specialist, and in my spare time, I research the Eddy family.
So, when did your involvement with the Eddy family begin? Like, what sparked your interest in the family?
The primary thing that sparked my interest in the Eddy family was a book by Joe Citro, who is a Burlington author. He still lives in Vermont, but he's moved away from the Burlington area, but he gathered up a bunch of Vermont paranormal stories and folklore, and he did a piece about the Eddy family, and I just always found it fascinating, and that's really what got me started on this path.
So you started giving presentations. When did you start your lectures and presentations?
I started doing presentations about the Eddy family in April of 2014, and that really came about because I went down to the Chittenden Historical Society and actually went down there to do some research about the Eddy family. And when I went down there, I found out that I pretty much had all the material that they already had, and when they saw what I had, they asked me to come down and do a presentation. So I did a 2-hour presentation for them, and then word started getting around, and I started visiting local historical societies as well as the Vermont Genealogical Society and the Vermont Archaeological Society and a few others.
So how long did it take you to accumulate like all this information that you have about the family?
It's been really a solid 6 years, I would say. I've known sort of about the Eddy family story since, I would say, the late 80s or early 90s. And then once I started really researching it heavily, which was about 2009, I was involved with some local independent filmmakers and thought it would make a good story, but I really wanted to have the research to back that up.
It'd make a really good story.
Definitely. So I just really started to dig into it. A lot of genealogical records I looked up, land records, and then newspapers and magazines, and really wanted to just find anything that could match what the Eddys said about themselves.
Right. But it's very hard to do the research because you don't really know what exactly is fact. And I know like the legend has been really distorted kind of over time. There's a lot of different stories associated with the family. How do you yourself kind of differentiate fact from fiction and the legend from the reality?
It's tough because, depending on what newspaper article you're reading, if you're reading it from someone who is a believer in the Eddy family, they're going to have sort of their own slant on it.
Oh, definitely.
And then, the skeptics, they all thought they were illusionists or magicians.
Right.
So really, I think the key lies somewhere in the middle, and
Yeah.
trying to take, different accounts of the same stories and trying to sort of line up what may have been actually going on.
Right. So how many people usually come to your presentations, and where do you do them?
I would say anywhere from 20 to, I've had as many as I think around 75 in Chittenden. It was
That's
standing
good.
room only there. It was a big crowd. And yeah, it's usually historical societies. I've also done one for a library. And then, the Vermont Genealogical Society, the Vermont Archaeology Society, and there's a couple others. I can't think. Oh, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. I just did one down there.
People coming to your presentations, do they already kind of know about the Eddy family, or are a lot of them just they don't know about the family yet? Are they coming to learn or to learn more?
Surprisingly, if I would have guessed, I would have thought more people would have been aware of the Eddy family just because it is a Vermont story.
Right.
And it's kind of been out there. A lot of people have read Joe Citro's books, and there's been articles in Yankee magazine and Vermont Life. But I would say the majority of the people that attend these presentations have never heard of them, or maybe they've just heard that the Eddy family used to hold seances, but really nothing else. And once in a while, if I'm doing it like in Rutland County, like in Chittenden or Pittsfield, there's a few more people have heard the story, and definitely in Chittenden, everybody knows the story.
Well, it's a very small town.
Yep, exactly. And and some of them will have their own stories about the family or experiences that have happened to them, and it's a lot of fun to sort of pick up on new things.
Yeah. The people coming to your presentations, are they like, how do they feel when they leave? Are they believers in the Eddy family, would you say, or are a lot of them skeptics, or are they coming for more of like the history and
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think there are definitely a few people who are coming to just learn more about what spiritualism was and what was happening in Vermont with this particular family. But in terms of whether they walk away believers or skeptics, to me, surprisingly, I would say more people walk away believing in the story. Even though, I've tried to present some evidence that might suggest there was something else going on.
And there is quite a bit of evidence that suggests that, they could be frauds in some areas.
But I think there's still a lot of question raised, and if they were frauds, it's really an amazing tale how they were able to pull it off.
Certainly. So what's your personal favorite story or fun fact about the Eddy family that you really enjoyed?
I think as far as favorite stories, I've always loved the story about, this sort of legend of the house rotating 90 degrees one day after a seance or during a seance. And that's one I always immediately debunk. There are really few things that I outright say, no way. But that one in particular, there's no evidence of it. I would have thought that, the Rutland Herald, whenever this supposedly happened, the next morning there would have been front page news, the Eddy home, rotated 90 degrees yesterday, something, but there's nothing. So I don't know where that story sort of originated.
That would be really fascinating to just find like where that story came from, or like how that even started.
I suspect, people were looking at the house the way it looks today, the High Life Ski Lodge, and they're probably looking at that, and then the old sketches of the house, and saying, somehow it turned. But I have no idea where that story originated from. And then a couple of other stories that sort of came up in my research. One of my favorite pieces that I'd never seen published anywhere before was that a meteor struck the farm December 13th,
Yeah,
Friday
I
the 13th.
actually didn't even know that story, and like even coming from like my family history and the stories I've been told, like I'd never heard of a lot of these things, like especially the meteor thing. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's a fun one, and in the article, it wasn't just published in Vermont; it was published throughout New England. And in the article, there's no mention of the Eddy family being spirit mediums. It just says Zephaniah Eddy, said that a meteor hit his farm. It was Friday the 13th, 1861. So
yeah, Friday the 13th. That's the interesting.
And then another story I always liked was it was a piece of correspondence between Horatio Eddy and Harry Houdini, and he talked about when he was arrested in Syracuse or Albany, I forget which, and he was forced to walk behind, kind of the stagecoach to jail, and his hands were cuffed. And when he got to the jail, he told the law enforcement there that if he was forced to sit in his jail cell the whole night with the handcuffs on, that he would let all the prisoners out before the night was done. And supposedly they honored his request and they took his handcuffs off. We don't know if that's true. There's no historical documentation to back that up. That's
right.
what Horatio said to Harry Houdini.
That's fascinating, though. So, like, what are some things that you kind of wish that you knew or wish that you could find out that was, like, facts? Or, like, if you went back and you could go back and talk to these people, in real life and, like, take a time machine back, like, what would you want to ask them and what would you want to know or see or...
So many questions. Many things I'd want to know and see. I think the main thing I would do if I could go back in time is I would definitely want to attend a seance.
Oh, definitely.
That would be a must. And depending what sort of what year I went back in time, if I were sort of going back in like 1875 or 1877, I would want to ask someone, whether it be William or Horatio or Mary or all of them, what happened to the family? Why did it sort of fall apart after the events of 1874 that made them really so popular in all the newspapers?
Yeah.
And then we sort of see glimpses of some family infighting, but over what? We don't really know.
Totally, yeah.
And then if it were sort of later in life, like in William's life before he turned senile, in his later years, I'd love to ask him, straight out, was it all worth it? Whether he was a fraud or not, was it all worth it?
Yeah. I'd wonder if they would be proud of their legacy today and that kind of thing.
And it's interesting, you mentioned legacy. I feel like the Eddy story still hasn't come out to the forefront the way it should have over the years.
I agree.
You hear about the Fox sisters in New York and the Davenport brothers of New York, but the Eddys somehow are kind of lost to all this, which is really surprising because their gift, whether it was real or not, is really more spectacular than what the Fox sisters or the Davenport brothers
they were very,
offered.
very theatrical.
Yep.
Yeah, you have to admit, even if they were frauds, it was a performance. It was a very good performance.
And to have, supposedly a physical manifestation of a departed loved one, that's a pretty amazing thing. And I'm just always surprised that we don't hear more about them and some of the historical, looks back on spiritualism and the history of spiritualism. In
so,
America.
like, why do you think that is, that they kind of dissolved from history for a little while and are still kind of not really prominent?
I think it's probably because by the time the Eddys really hit their peak, which to me was 1874, they had already, spiritualism had sort of already started to decline. Other people, including the Fox sisters and the Davenport brothers, had already been, there were a lot of skeptics out there who had debunked them in some way or another. Or in the case of the Davenport brothers, they were caught in London in a performance as frauds. And this was while the Eddys were sort of coming to the forefront in the mid-1860s here in the States. And then the Eddys themselves supposedly came out and self-exposed themselves, William and Mary specifically, in New York and in Vermont, and started to do presentations and exhibitions showing how they were fooling the audience with the spirit cabinet routine. And it's amazing that despite them exposing themselves in 1867, 1869, whenever that was, that years later they were still able to sort of make a comeback with this new phenomena of manifestations.
Right.
And sort of gain their notoriety through that.
Yeah. So to give some perspective, also, So, like, how kind of famous or popular were the Eddies back in the day when they were, at their peak?
At their peak, they were very, very popular. In popular in good and bad ways.
Right, yeah.
Because Colonel Olcott had gone down. He went down in 1874 in I think it was August, and then they published, he stayed for 5 days, and there was an article published, I think it was early September, in the New York Sun. And it was really created quite a sensation to the point where the New York Daily Graphic wanted him to go back down to stay for 12 weeks and really dig into it. And he would write letters that would be published twice a week in the New York Daily Graphic every Tuesday and Friday. And that's what really, the Eddies were starting to get well known. There's evidence of, some newspaper articles about them traveling in the country. But 1874 is really, it was Colonel Olcott's letters that really, kind of brought them out to the forefront. But that was a good thing because it was bringing more people to come see them. But on the other hand, it was bringing a lot more skepticism, and a lot more people wanted to go there to investigate, to prove it to be false.
Yeah, oh, true, yeah. So are you a believer in what they did? Or are you more skeptical? Are there some things that you believe in, other things not?
Yeah, I always tell people it depends what day you ask me, but I think
same here.
in general, I tend to lean towards, that they were really more illusionists. And that, in particular, the spirit cabinet routine has been pretty well documented on how magicians perform that trick. And the Davenport brothers themselves corresponded with Harry Houdini and told him how they did that routine.
Right.
There are magicians today who still perform the same spirit cabinet routine. As far as the materializations, Colonel Olcott believed that the materializations were real, but some of the other things they did were not.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think, maybe they did have some ability, because it would have been difficult to fool everyone, to believe that it was your loved one. Like, how did they know things about them?
And I mean, they spoke in different languages, they were different cultures, different sizes and weights of all these different kinds of spirits. It'd be hard to, dress up in costumes to, be all of these different types of people.
Right. So I think, maybe they could speak with the dead, and they were getting things from beyond. But as far as the materialization piece, I don't think that was real. There's just too much evidence that doesn't support that.
Yes, yeah.
But we'll never know.
That is true, unless we go back in time.
Exactly.
Today there's a lot of, there's TV shows with mediums, ghosts are pretty popular. The paranormal is, the subject of a lot of popular culture and movies. Why do you think, like, the Eddy brothers and just kind of this paranormal is kind of coming back into our lives, and how we're kind of seeking out the paranormal again?
I think there's a couple things. I think like in the 70s, we sort of saw a resurgence in interest in the paranormal and the occult, and then things sort of declined for a little while. But I think the introduction of reality television, I think, is a big part of it, because now you could have people going into, supposedly haunted places and filming what was going on inside with infrared cameras and things like that. And I think that's really sort of created a new interest in it. As far as the Eddy family, I don't know if there's a renewed interest in that family, because I still think their story hasn't gotten out there yet. There's some people in Vermont who are trying to keep it alive, beside myself, which include Joe Citro. He's still very obsessed with the story.
Yeah, he's great.
And then Greg Guma, he did some early work on some interviews, and he also wrote a book about the Eddy family, which was a fictionalized account of what happened.
So how do you think that the Eddy family, their story could make kind of a comeback? And how do you think that could happen?
Definitely. I think the key thing is, well, two things. One is, I'd like to see a really well-written book, sort of a timeline of what happened, all the different accounts in the newspapers, and then a film, which I'm working on a screenplay called The Devil's Cabinet, which hopefully will really generate some interest, and who knows, that might bring more research out of it. There may be people who are have other means of research than I do now that could bring new stories to light.
Right, that'd be very cool. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you.
I next decided to interview my father, Eugene Fairbanks. He's a direct descendant of the Eddy family and grew up hearing the legend from a different perspective. Because Mary Eddy was his great-grandmother, he first heard about the Eddys' involvement with spiritualism through the family.
My name is Eugene B. Fairbanks. I live in Granville, New York, along with my daughter and my wife, and I'm an artist, and I have great interest in my heritage and my ancestors.
Can you tell the audience, give them a more detailed history of how you're descended from the Eddy family?
That would be around 1846 that Julia Eddy and Zephaniah Eddy moved from western Vermont to a little hamlet called Chittenden, Vermont. And there they had several children, and one of the children, whose name was Mary, was my great-grandmother. And she had a daughter named Lola. And Lola was only about around 2 years old when they were having the major happenings in Chittenden around 1874. Lola married a man by the same name that I have because I'm the third, Eugene B. Fairbanks. They had, Lola and my father, and then I was born to my father and Bloodwin Fairbanks, who was of Welsh heritage and lived down in West Paulet, Vermont.
So, how did you first hear about the Eddy family? Were you told these stories when you were a child? I know you told me stories when I was little. How did you learn about your ancestry?
Well, I think on my mother's side, she wasn't very interested in what they called at that time the spooks. My parents would sometimes talk about things that were happening in the family. But there was another big occurrence that happened before I was born. And that was my grandfather disappeared. No one knew where he went. And my mother and father used to talk about it in the car, and I would pick up little bits of the conversation and try to combine it together to get more of a picture of what was happening. And my mother would say things like, oh, they probably took him, those weird people up in Chittenden, and took him to Honto's cave, and I bet they killed him. And this, of course, interested me because the words Honto's cave seemed embedded in my mind, and I always said to myself, well, when I get older, I'm going to try to find this Honto's cave.
So you didn't know what Honto's cave was. Can you just give like a brief description of what that is, Honto's cave?
It's a surprising thing because it's not really a cave as we think of caves in the side of the mountain. It's two huge rocks which look totally out of place, like some aliens placed them there or something. They did the same sort of thing that they did in the circle room. They would create images of the deceased. And
what do you mean by create images? Would they, what does that mean?
That means that, well, they used to have people come from all over the eastern part of the United States. It was quite a famous place, the Eddy homestead. Some of the things that took place would be that people would pay lots of money to see this, and they would bring to life deceased relatives and people that they knew, so they actually almost could touch their hands or converse with them.
So where did you get all of this information that you just told me? Did you hear that from word of mouth, like passed down, or did you hear it from outside sources?
I think it happened slowly. As the years progressed and I got older, I'd be looking at photo albums that my mother had, and I'd come across a photograph and I'd say, oh, who's that, Mom? And she would say, oh, that was your great-grandmother. She was in theater, you know. Oh, and then there'd be a picture of my father sitting on her lap. And so I kind of started to put things together. And then there have been quite a few articles written about the happenings at the Eddy farm. I read all kinds of articles in magazines and a publication, Yankee magazine. But other magazines, I think one was Scientific American, in which they were
Oh, wow.
exploring these kinds of things.
Do you believe in kind of what the Eddy family did?
I believe somewhat in it because I've had several experiences that I think are beyond the normal.
What would be your favorite legend or your favorite story that you heard? Just a short kind of. Do you have a favorite piece of the legend or some fact about them that you think is really interesting?
Yeah, I find a lot of the stories are very interesting.
But if you had
like-
to just pick one
Okay.
story. That
Could I
you-
pick two? One's a short one. Well,
Short stories.
when they were little kids, your great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, and her brothers and other children in the house, sometimes they would see a floating image going from room to room, and sometimes this image would materialize into a form.
Right.
And everybody saw it. Of course, the mother saw it. She had the second sight, but the kids saw it as well. And sometimes it would transform itself into an image that wasn't scary, but they saw it and they got used to it. The father, Zephaniah, he never saw any of these things. But one night, one winter night, they were sitting out in the living room, and Mary looked out of the window, and because she heard some bells and some noise, and coming down the road were a pair of horses pulling a wagon behind them. And they pulled right into the yard. And they all went to the window, and they looked out, and then they walked outside, and the father walked out too, Zephaniah. And he saw the image. And it was a woman sitting in an open carriage, and there was a horseman, coachman, sitting up wearing a top hat, and horses had plumes on their head, and it was the whole outfit. And they all saw it. And then it started to pull away, and it just dissipated.
That's an interesting
And the
story.
father saw it as well. And from that point on, he believed in it. And of course, the father, he did everything,
The Zephaniah.
he did everything in his lifetime, and the children at the farm, to try to beat out of them these beliefs.
So we've talked about the Eddy family and your feelings about them, and kind of a bit about your history and your background with the legend and what you've heard. So let's talk about today. There's a lot of mediums on TV today. There's it's become a big part of our culture today. A lot of people are interested in communicating with the dead, whether it's for fun or people are taking it seriously. If you really believe in it, there's a lot of real believers out there today. Again, the Eddy family, the spiritualism movement that they grew out of was kind of due to the cultural climate of the Civil War.
Right.
And the feelings about so many people lost so many loved ones, and it was it came out of that culture of that time period. What do you think is a part of our culture today that's making us look towards spiritualism and there's an interest in the Eddy family again? What do you think is happening in our society today in that we're so interested again?
That's a very good question. I can only relate some of my own opinions on that. You mentioned the Civil War. Well, after the Civil War, there was a period of time when people suddenly began to have more money and more free time. I think maybe that's part of the situation today. People have more free time. A lot of people are spending how many hours a day in front of their computers and playing computer games, and maybe that's becoming a little boring. Technology has led us so far and really so fast
It's grown very fast.
the kind of programs, for example, that we have on television, come on, how many good shows are there? I mean, people are becoming bored, I think, with television because it's so bad. The second thing is, I think people, regardless of the age, have always had a yearning for the unknown, the mystery of life, and they like to probe into that. And then more and more things have been happening to individuals that you find articles about in the paper that can't be explained in reality terms. There's other things that are going on, and So I think that's always going to be popular.
I know a lot of our family members are not very proud of the family history, and they think they're kind of con artists. Are you proud to be descended from the Eddy family?
I certainly am. I think they did a lot for the people of their time. They opened a lot of people's imaginations in their eyes, and they weren't. I think there's a lot to be proud of. I think that to survive, that Mary and her brothers Horatio and William, they had to learn to do tricks like Houdini and other people like that in order to survive their life in a circus. It was a cruel, cruel time for them,
Yes.
and they were only young children.
Yes.
But I firmly believe they did possess some powers, but the whole thing was not real. I think a lot of it was fake.
My mother's interest in the Eddy family started after meeting my father. Already having a passion for genealogy and ancestry, she's worked for years accumulating articles, photographs, and information about the Eddy family. For the sake of this project, she was willing to share some of the artifacts that she's collected from one of her binders dedicated to the research of this family.
This is a copy of Yankee magazine dated January 1987, who wrote about when ghosts came to Chittenden, Vermont. And they wrote, this was taken from Olcott's book, People from the Other World, as are the engravings. This is the Eddy brothers, William and Horatio. The family actually thinks that it goes the other way around, that this is Horatio and this is William, but this is the farmhouse, this is the article, this is what the circle room looked like. This is a cross section that an illustrator came up with, Henry Olcott, and created these for Olcott for his book. These were pictures of the materialized entities. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the creator of Sherlock Holmes,
Yep, I've
was
read some of his
also
books.
a very interested in spiritualism, and he
Oh, I did
read
not
the
know that.
Olcott book, and he wrote about it. He wrote a 2-volume history of spiritualism, and a large section of that book is devoted to the Eddy family. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did not visit the farmhouse. I have pictures of I have a lovely picture of Mary Eddy.
So that is my great-great-grandmother. At what age would you say that is?
Oh, this was probably shortly before she died. She died in 1910. I don't remember offhand how old she was. This was Mary Eddy, and this is Shelley's grandfather,
Oh,
her
cool.
grandson.
Very cool.
And it's written on the photograph that she worked as an actress in vaudeville, playing in Boston, Massachusetts at that time. I have pictures of the Eddy brothers. These were probably the actual photos that the engravings in Olcott's book, he used this.
So this is an actual photograph of William and Horatio.
Right. We're not sure which one's William or which one's Horatio.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, they do look similar.
Right.
Just different beard styles.
They were not exactly honest about their ages, so it's kind of hard to tell.
One of their gravestones says that one of them died at 99 years old. Is that truth, or?
He was probably in his 90s. This is a picture of the exterior of the circle room. We're not sure when this was taken or why this was taken, but this is a gathering that seems to have some spiritual meaning.
Oh, and those are the circles that you were talking about.
Right, the rings.
Interesting.
Right, and there are signs in the background which I cannot quite read. They talk about hope.
So who were these people? It was just a, were they all like mediums, or friends of the Eddy family, or do you?
We suspect that this is one of the sisters, perhaps.
The Eddy family was large. I should say that also. It wasn't just Mary, William, and Horatio. There was multiple siblings. There was how many siblings?
They died at various times. There were 10 at various times.
Right.
A couple died as teenagers, but a number of them were engaged as spiritualists.
Yes.
At least 1, 2, 3, 4. At least 5. At least 5 of them were active spiritualists.
But Mary, William, and Horatio are the main spiritualists of the Eddy family.
Yes, when you read the accounts, they are the ones that are most.
You know,
often
their other
named.
siblings have really some tragic stories that I won't get into, but that if you look up the history, they have some pretty tragic stories in the family.
Yes, the youngest daughter, Alice, Mary's youngest sister, was considered insane, committed to a poorhouse, and committed suicide at a very young age.
So that's just one story of
One died of tuberculosis. Another son died after serving a few months in the Civil War. We believe he had consumption or typhoid or something that.
So they had ties to, people in my family died in the Civil War also. So,
Right.
You know, my ancestors were very much in that culture of chaos and sadness and grief and trying to find some sort of, trying to find some ground in this world that was just unreal.
Making sense of why an 18-year-old boy full of promise would die.
And that's what many families after the Civil War were facing.
Right. That's a close-up of the circles.
Yeah, the circles, which we, again, the symbolism of things. There is something up, a sign that says, like, something hope.
Yeah, and he's holding a sign. That one is too blurred to see. But it had to have been some sort of, there's a bouquet with flowers over here. So it was some sort of memorial or celebration of some sort. This is also some sort of a hanging, it actually looks like black flowers to me, but I'm not really sure.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
This is thought to be Mary Eddy. This is thought to be one of the brothers, Horatio or William.
Holding one of the signs.
Right. It's just hard to tell.
Today there are many individuals who have gained an interest in the Eddy family that was lost for many years. Whether the tales of the Eddy family are fact or fiction, one must decide for themselves. But the hype surrounding the tale is growing thanks to individuals such as Jason who are bringing the story back into the public eye. I'm excited to see what the world of literature and film has to offer for the future of the Eddy family legacy. Until then, I hope to see the story continue to be passed down, whether through family or strangers in the community looking to enrich their lives with one of the best ghost stories in all of New England.